My name is Eric Browning. I'm the building official for community planning and development in City and County of Denver. Christy, go ahead.
I'm Christy Collins. I am a member of Eric's team working on various sustainability initiatives that we have going on in community planning and development. Erica?
Thanks, Christy. Hi, everyone. I'm Erica DeLello, and I'm a project manager for NORESCO working on the codes and standards team. I'll pass it to you, Kira.
Hi, I'm Kira Winkle. I work with Erica on the codes and standards team at NORESCO as well.
And I'm Kristen Salinas, also from NORESCO, working on the codes and standards team.
Great. Thank you very much. So with that, before we switch over to the mural board that we've been using the past couple of meetings that we'll be using again today in a slightly different format, I'm going to ask Christy to do a broader introduction for us to talk about our goals for today. Thank you, Christy.
Yeah, sure. So this being our third and final meeting, we want to finish collecting ideas and thoughts and feedback from this group as much as we possibly can. And our goal today is to walk away having received adequate high-level guidance from this group pertaining to the priorities and opportunities and barriers too. We've talked a lot about barriers, but barriers that can be removed to empower us as a city team to go forward with NORESCO and to develop proposals that can then be advanced to the Denver Green Code Committee in later in the summer for consideration to be taken to City Council. So we've heard a lot about some of the challenges. We've heard a lot of really good high ideas, and that's all really good information. Now we're trying to sort through and prioritize so that we can focus our attention in the right place. We want to make sure that what we focus on is achievable for 2021, but that we also identify things that we want to hold on to for future code cycles that maybe can't be incorporated in 2021, but are really important to Denver as a community and need to continue to be pursued through this bigger Denver Green Code effort that's going to be ongoing through many code cycles. And we just want to make sure that we're focusing on the things that are going to have the greatest impact on our community and on our projects, and towards shifting the mindset on as many project teams as possible to take into consideration that bigger impact that projects have on the community and how every project plays a role, and trying to get a bigger view towards this holistic community and how we keep Denver strong into the future for a longer future. So it's not an abstract goal with the Denver Green Code. We don't have one target that we're aiming at. We just want to support the longer future of the Denver community. So today we just want to sort through what we can do in 2021 and get some guidance and make sure that that's what we walk away with. And just going back to something that Bill Reed said during the first meeting, there are approximately 4,500 communities of 1 million or more people globally. And so it feels really daunting to say, well, what are we going to do in Denver, to change the global situation? But that's not a lot of big communities. In Denver, 750,000 people. So we're another one on top of that pile. But if each one of those communities focuses on forwarding what keeps that community strong and viable, as well as how we contribute to the bigger changes that are happening globally, then we really do make a difference. And 4,500 really isn't that much when you think about it in those terms. So we need to think about how we keep our community strong and how we play a role in that bigger picture of what's happening beyond the boundaries of our community as well, and just kind of look at it from that big picture. So we're asking everybody to one more time keep that big view in mind, but then also talk with us now about some more things that we'll go through that will help us to focus on the right proposals for 2021 and put some things in the bucket for 2024 and code cycles beyond, so that we can keep growing this Denver Green Code, making it more effective, engaging more project teams, engaging more of the development community, and having a bigger and bigger impact. So I think that was all I really wanted to lead off with at this point.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Christy. And Erica, now I'll turn it over to you to activate the mural board and give an introduction for starting to work through that.
Great, thank you. So I just posted a link in the chat. If you could go ahead and open that up, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just give me one sec. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Great. So just a little recap on how to use the mural board. Today we'll be using Post-it notes and dragging these stars that you see down here. If you would like to add a Post-it note, you just double left click and you can write in any comments. You can drag it wherever you need to and edit the size as appropriate. And then for the stars, it's as easy as taking these, moving them wherever you'd like to place your vote. So with that said, I would ask that no one deletes anyone's vote or deletes anyone's Post-it note. We just want to gather everyone's input as much as possible. So any help in that would be appreciated. And so with that, I think we'll go ahead and I'll give it over to Kira and Kristen to give us a little recap. And if you are having any issues with the mural board, feel free to write in the chat your comments and we'll be able to capture them there for you. Otherwise, just feel free to ping me if there are any issues and I'll try to help you get it sorted.
Thanks, Erica. So I think we wanted to kind of kick off early with a recap of what we went over on workshop 2. We got some fantastic feedback. So thank you guys all for your feedback last week. We got some really fantastic comments back and we went through all of those before we put together the agenda for this meeting. And so here in the workshop 2 recap, we talked about the structure in terms of flexibility. It looks like flexibility over simplification was something that you guys were in favor of. More performance-based compliance options, more compliance options outside of certification. So you'll see as we go through the agenda today that those things have been put into some items for consideration for additional options. We looked at more flexibility for existing buildings and other types of projects like adaptive reuse. And some of these other items we're going to try and do for the 2021 code and beyond. Last week we talked about incentives, so we got some really great feedback from you guys on incentives, as well as education. We talked a lot about that last week and got some very, very quality feedback there. You guys also told us what was important to you. So we looked at community, neighborhood priorities, workforce development, landscaping. There was a lot to do with landscaping in terms of natives, green space, soils and compost, tree protection, using reclaimed or gray water for irrigation, bird and bee friendly. So all of these things we took into consideration, and you'll see as we move through today's agenda that those things have been woven in. So I think we can go on to the next column, which is kind of what our ideas for the adoption for 2021. So we'd like to move no cost and best practices into mandatory building code. We will try and expand the definitions and acronyms. I know that was something I think from the first meeting that was mentioned to make this a more user-friendly code. The compliance table to be also more user-friendly. And we have hopes to separate out residential from non-residential in some matter to make sure that that delineation is noted. So any high-level feedback on those items before we keep going? Kira, I don't know if you want to add anything either, or Christy, feel free to jump in.
So far.
Okay, if something comes up, definitely let us know. Last, we've kind of identified the things that you want to see being mandatory that are really important from those important topics that we talked about. We went through all of the prescriptive requirements in the Denver Green Code and found some that are those low cost, those best practices. And here's kind of a short list of those items that we think really are something that all projects should look at doing. And so those involve landscape, exterior lighting, indoor air quality, materials and resources, and construction for and plans for operation. So a lot of these things are moving into mandatory codes, and we don't know exactly where those are going to live yet, but those are the items that are really kind of baseline requirements for all projects in Denver. So I hadn't planned to go into deep conversation about these, but as you'll see, I think most of these items we have talked about in some fashion or form over the last 2 weeks, or they are best practices that we see in the community as a whole, from developers and from our own projects that we work on. And so also from feedback from you guys. So I don't know if are there any of these that send up red flags to anybody on the call that you would like to express your concern about? Or is there any that you want to champion?
I just have a quick one, quick two. On landscape, one of the questions in my mind is who's going to review this? If it becomes part of iCode, does that suddenly become the architectural reviewer is going to be reviewing that? Because we're also, I think, going to see forestry reviewing that simultaneously, and again gets into that issue that we've discussed earlier where we get conflicting feedback from different departments.
So that is one of the things that we're working on, and especially for these things that would be moving to mandatory codes, it wouldn't just be the iCodes actually just to tweak the language there. It would be just mandatory codes and regulations within the city. The goal isn't to have conflicting codes. We are talking with other agencies to figure out where the appropriate place would be to move mandatory things. And then similarly, with the provisions that relate to landscape that are within the Denver Green Code, it is our goal and commitment to make sure that we have the right people reviewing the right things and not multiple people reviewing different things with different opinions. We're working with the other agencies to sort out who's reporting, who's reviewing what. It would not just be within the building department related to some of these things.
Great, thanks. One other thing I just want to mention is lighting controls has become more and more complex and more over-designed in a lot of small buildings. And just a thought there is to think about whether that applies to every size building. You know, suddenly I've got a small building that I'm spending $100,000 on a lighting control system that nobody is ever going to understand in that building. Whereas some of the older stuff with occupancy sensors and vacancy sensors on some of the smaller projects may be pretty adequate and really do the trick. So just something to think about. Scale here is important on some of these things. On a big project, some of these may be negligible. On a small project, they may be really impactful.
And Christy, do you want to just talk briefly about, you know, what the recommendations from these working groups and from our work go to committee and how that gets formalized?
Yeah, sure. So as far as the things that are moving to mandatory codes, right now we are compiling a document or multiple documents. We're compiling together the things that we are suggesting move from the Denver Green Code into mandatory. And then we need to discuss those provisions with the different agencies that might absorb those into their regulations. If they are suggested to move into an iCode, then those suggested new mandatory provisions would go through the proposal process, just like any other proposal, going to those specific committees. So if it's suggested to move into the IBC, then a proposal will be created that would then be vetted by the IBC committee. If it's suggested to go to a regulation within another agency, then we will figure out what the update cycle is on that regulation within that agency, and how receptive that agency is to receiving that mandatory provision, and what public process is involved there. We'll go through the process to move anything to mandatory. Anything that we think is not going to be able to move forward through mandatory or through this iCode committee process gets rejected from moving to mandatory, we'll come back to live in the Denver Green Code again. So that's the intention from a process standpoint with these guys. It's not that we just today have determined that these are going to mandatory codes and it's done. It's just the beginning of the road.
I think I also maybe missed how this move out of DGC to mandatory codes wound up being what it is, but I see two major things missing from this list, and one of it is a 75% landfill diversion rate for projects, for new construction projects or existing construction projects, and also there's nothing for indoor plumbing fixtures to push that that savings rate as high as we can push it.
Okay, and that's good feedback, and we can look at those too, because that is why we want the ideas, definitely. So great.
And is 75%, is that doable for most projects?
In Denver it is, yeah. If you start to move outside of Denver, it's a lot more challenging, but in our city it is absolutely doable.
Okay, fantastic.
Hey, this is Paul. I like all these, but some of these descriptors seem so vague, it's hard to really react to whether they're things that are a great idea or not. It really depends on how these get written up and described. So what's the process for fleshing things out in order to be able to evaluate whether they're really going to make a difference? Like under exterior lighting, backlight and glare requirements. Well, yeah, we want to reduce backlight and glare, but it's all around how you define that, just as an example.
That is the committee process.
What's that?
Sorry, Paul, I didn't realize you weren't done.
Yeah, and another one that confuses me, like under IEQ, separate controls for lighting for presentations. I agree, the code is already way too unnecessarily complicated when it comes to lighting controls anyway. So I'm really reluctant to make that more complicated. So curious what that one is about, controls for lighting for presentations, as an example.
So
Go ahead.
Because we only have 6 hours with this group, we did not plan to go through the details of all of these. There are details that go with all of these. This is kind of the high level topical approach. The process is that those detailed proposals will be taken through the public process. So it'll be further vetted through the committee process, like the ones that you just called out would go through the appropriate iCode committees for consideration. So that is where we would get into the weeds of actually, that was a nice idea and a good topic, but the way we've written the proposal isn't so good. It needs modification or it has to be rejected.
Mm-hmm.
And for the language as it stands, it's what's ever in the 2019 Denver Green Code. So for the backlight and glare requirements, those would be in the current code right now. Same lighting for presentations. These are really intended to be low-hanging things that should already be mandatory already, and are throughout different parts of the country. And so this is just kind of trying to level the playing field a little bit.
How can any of us volunteer to engage on some of the detailed discussions around these?
Great question.
Sorry, I missed the first part. Were you asking how to volunteer to engage?
Yeah. So for example, I'd really like to be involved in any of these lighting controls or the ASHRAE 62.1 issue, the exterior lighting issues. I'd like to, be able to follow that pretty closely. So, and I'm sure others on the call would like to jump in on a lot of these as well.
So there are a couple ways. One is to submit to join one of the committees. If you feel like you can invest the time and the intellectual focus on serving on one of the committees, then then please fill out an application because we will be recruiting for those committees over the next month. And then the other part is if you don't feel like you can serve on a committee, but there are specific topics that you'd like to speak to, the agendas for those committee meetings will be posted 5 business days prior to the committee hearings. And you can check those agendas and see when they're popping up and join for that specific meeting to talk to the specific topics that you're interested in.
Great, thanks, Christy.
Quick comment on that 75% landfill diversion rate. I have not had any experience with that in the city and county of Denver. I have had experience with that outside of Denver. And I think like Adam said, I've been lucky to hit 30% in those other market areas. And it's forced me to budget 4 to 6 times more for trash hauling than I do in other municipalities. The resources that we've been able to find to actually accomplish that are few and far between and significantly more expensive than standard trash hauling services that we've had in the past.
Definitely. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Is that you're saying outside of Denver or within Denver?
Outside of Denver, we haven't done landfill diversion inside of Denver yet. But the resources in the metro area to accomplish that have been significantly more expensive and few and far between, at least for the number of vendors that are out there that provide that service. From our experience, I'd love to hear if someone's had different experience in it.
Just a specific example of, I think it's about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago.
My name is Adam, and I was born in 1996. Technology.
There was 2 facilities that would take drywall and recycle gypsum and recycle them, and both of those stopped taking gypsum for whatever reason. So I don't know if there would be any sort of broader conversations about landfills or the city potentially taking and recycling drywall as one example. Masonry is another thing that is complicated. But I would agree that, yeah, I mean, we try to divert as much waste as possible, but it does come at a cost. Not that's insurmountable in the big picture, but I second Bill's comment. Just a question about process. You mentioned that, you know, these are recommendations for the move out of Denver Green Code into mandatory codes, and they'll be taken to committees. Will we have an opportunity to review and comment on these in more detail between, you know, now and when they go to committee? And I think the specific example that I just need to educate myself on is the HVAC refrigerant requirements. I just don't know enough about it, whether that's you know, doing away with refrigerants in general, or if it's just refrigerant management plan.
Yeah, and not using the refrigerants that you can't get anymore. I mean, this is like really the prerequisites, if you're thinking about it from a lead perspective, the prerequisites for a lead.
Got it. Okay.
But as far as the opportunity to review goes, yes, on that also, we will be posting at the end of June all of the proposals for all of the iCode committees, so that the community does have a chance to absorb them and think about them before we start the committee process in I think it's late August. But then there will be agendas set for each committee meeting. So after you've previewed, those proposals might gain some more detail, but they're not going to gain, you know, new ideas per se. They'll just be more fleshed out, and they'll be posted as part of the agenda the week prior to that committee meeting so that you know when to join.
And in the meantime, we've been leaving these boards up for 24 hours after our calls. And I can come back in here after our call today and add in the section numbers from the current DGC code so that it's a little easier for you to find it in that code language.
Great, thank you.
And then I also would encourage you, it looks like Erica maybe has been adding what people have been verbalizing, but I do think if you see things that are missing from what we should move out of the green code into mandatory codes, definitely please add a note here with what you think should move.
With that, Kira, and in recognition of the time, I'd ask that we move down into the body of our work today to explain the columns and rows that we'll be discussing in more detail.
Yeah. So we created a sort of a table on the left side, and we created this list of all kinds of different options for how we could adjust the structure and the process for the code, largely based on your feedback here on the very left. And then we have a column for recommend to adopt, to take into consideration, do not recommend to adopt, and then something that you like the idea of, but we just really can't do it in this code cycle. You don't think so good, about future code development. And we put all these stars up above for you to drag down and vote. And we will go through these line by line. And then over on the very right, a much bigger column here. You can be thinking about this as we work through these. You can relate them to some of these compliance paths, but we really wanted to ask you, what supports would you need to be able to implement a small number of the easily achievable measures in the current green code on all projects? And those are not just the voluntary projects that might participate in the DGC code. This is for everything, because we do think there are some no cost and low cost measures that every project could comb that code and find a few things that would work for them. So we'd like to know what you would need to get that done. So for our additional compliance options, definitely heard from you all that we need to be considering some project types, maybe some different compliance paths for what's really relevant to each of these product types. And we heard adaptive reuse, renovations and additions, and nonprofit. And that's in addition to, just as a reminder, up under the adoption plan that we are already thinking about would be to separate out the residential and non-residential here. So in addition to that, we've got these different project type categories. Does anyone have any comments or questions on these to discuss?
You want to just read it, Kira?
Sure. So we're thinking half of requirements for new construction projects for the prescriptive path, and then having a lower threshold for performance, maybe a lead gold level for these project types. And that would be adaptive reuse, renovations and additions, and nonprofits.
So I think the thinking here was trying to give these project types that are a little bit more challenging, a little bit of a break on what they need to comply with. So a little bit of their own compliance path within the Denver Green Code. So that could be either in the prescriptive kind of performance or prescriptive path or the performance path. We've got lots of options, I think. So if there's any feedback on that, that would be helpful. You guys can drag your stars.
Brett, I'm going to call you out here. I'm curious what you think of this opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, the devil's always in the details, but I think it's great that we consider them specifically because it's they are unique challenges. And I also think that it's great to accommodate nonprofits in some way, just because the costs and the they're struggling to raise money for these projects. So yeah, anything we can do to make it work. At the same time, I think the education is important because they are concerned with what their ongoing operating costs are going to be, the nonprofits as well as adaptive reuse. So I'm encouraged to see this. The devil's obviously going to be in the details, but I think it's great that we really call it out and think about it. And as we look at a performance path, I wonder if there's some modeling based on the embodied energy, the fact that, when we talk about diverting 75% landfill diversion, the fact that we're not tearing down existing buildings, is a whole lot that's not going into a landfill. So would love to see, as we look at the performance paths for that, some acknowledgement or some modeling that goes into that of the benefits of just simply retaining the building, even though it may be difficult to get an adaptive reuse to the energy levels that we'd like. Well, we've also at the same time got the embodied energy, the embodied carbon in those buildings that's not going into a landfill. But thank you.
Thank you.
Do you think like a lower level, so if LEED Platinum was, one of the performance level options, something like LEED Gold would be aggressive enough to kind of fit within what we're thinking, but also give these types of projects a little bit of a break because they do have some challenges, inherent challenges?
I have to admit that I don't know enough about the ins and outs of the differences between the levels and how that applies to give you a reasonable answer.
Okay.
But
it's like a gold score of 60 versus a score of 80. So, obviously there are points that are, or credits that are between like 1 and 5 points. So you'd have a significant reduction in what you're going out.
I mean, I do think that's important, but I also, as I say, I think it's important to recognize the benefits of retaining those buildings as a core piece of that performance path. Because the easy option right now is to just scrape it off, send it all to the landfill and build a new building. And while the new building may meet some energy thresholds, well, we're not accounting for what we've just thrown away.
I don't want to complicate things too much, but a critical distinction here could be whether the building is a designated historic structure or not. And that triggers so many decisions in terms of the performance of the building and our ability to touch the envelope, the windows and things like that or not, that there may be an important distinction to be made whether the building is designated.
Yeah, that's a great point. Those are
when you take a look at historic preservation, I mean, that's definitely putting itself into a whole new category. And you're locked in. Whether it's a landmark thing or a National Park Service thing.
Right.
I think what this is incentivizing people to do is reuse and do adaptive reuse for buildings that are not in those designations, and that's where I think the incentives are really a positive thing that could add a lot of value to development. Because to Fred's point, the baseline is to rip it down and start fresh, because I think a lot of people think that adaptive reuse of reusing structure is cheaper because you don't have to rebuild structure. Is the opposite. Adaptive reuse is a lot more expensive than trying to build new.
Absolutely. I mean, our experience is almost always that it would have been far cheaper just to tear something down and build something from scratch. And I think that there's the embodied energy that's going away. There's all of that, but I think also there's the societal benefits of adaptive reuse and what that adds to a community and what that adds to a neighborhood.
With that being said, it seems like there should be a direct path forward for those types of projects as well, right? So we're acknowledging that there's going to be one path for the majority of projects, but then there should probably be another path for the historic homes or homes that are in a parkway district. And since we know that upfront, creating those, into the code and giving them an avenue either way.
Yeah, I think the historic, it's an interesting question. I mean, there's a real discussion about whether to go for a historic designation or not based on the additional restrictions it puts on. But it certainly does put restrictions on, especially things like windows and what we can and cannot do. I mean, we're looking at that at the Evans School right now. And, there are some liners that you can use, such as were used at Union Station. But there's some limitations on what you can do, definitely.
What about this category? We've talked about affordability concerns throughout the marketplace. Is there a reason why affordable housing isn't included in this category.
I guess I assume that was part of nonprofit, but I guess they're not all nonprofit.
Yeah, there's a lot of for-profit builders doing projects with affordable housing in it.
Are you talking 100% affordable housing?
There are some projects that are 100% affordable housing. Some are, there's a percentage of the community that's affordable housing, for those particular homes. Considering this alternative pathway seems reasonable to help control those additional costs a little bit, yet still provide a high level.
And I think the reason why we hadn't put it in there, which is not to say that we shouldn't put it in there, is because we do have a separate conversation that's ongoing related to incentivizing affordable housing and putting requirements for greater affordable housing across projects consistently in the city. So we wanted to make sure that we aren't trading building project performance against affordable housing. We don't want the two to be in conflict. We want to encourage both together. And we actually think that they're symbiotic. So just because a project is affordable doesn't mean that it can't also be high performing and affordably constructed. We've seen that elsewhere. So that was the thinking of not putting that one on the list initially.
I think if you were going to include it on the list, you'd have a pretty high threshold on what percentage is affordable. This isn't a 10% or 15% affordability. This is, an 80% to 100% affordable project if we were going to include it in this as a separate path.
And right now, the city generally defines affordable housing as 100% of the housing is 80% AMI or less, right? So, but we could definitely find the right place to ratchet that and address it there. Absolutely.
Could I ask a quick question about scope? So I haven't heard much discussion around carbon. Is that something that you prefer that the Energy Committee focus on? Because every decision that is listed, every strategy that's been talked about here does have an impact on carbon emissions, whether embodied or operational, and has an impact on air quality and communities and so on. Is that not one of the guiding principles for these decisions?
No, we should definitely talk about it here also. It's all intertwined. It's hard to draw a line between energy and this. We just happen to have two groups. So we welcome that discussion too.
And it'll come as we go farther down. So I think we got some really good feedback on that, and let's keep moving here. The next section, which some of you guys have already gotten to, is really looking for additional options for third-party performance compliance paths. So there's 3 of these here that were present in the 2019 Denver Green Code. So lead version 4.1 Platinum, Passive House. I think the Passive House also had all of the non-energy requirements from the GGC and for prescriptive, also the zero net on-site energy. So we've added one here, which is the Living Building Challenge PEDAL certification, which is something that you guys had mentioned. There was also some other ones as well. We want to make sure that anything that is in this third-party option for compliance is at the same threshold of stringency. And so that's, and also all encompassing with the project. So a lot of the certifications really target, waste or carbon or water. And so we really wanted something that was all encompassing. So we welcome your feedback here. If that is, these are great. We need to add a few more. We like these 4. We welcome feedback on this. And Christy, I don't know if you said for the pilot, you already have projects that are doing some of these. So maybe you want to mention that.
We do. We have a project that was submitted to pursue the Passive House plus the non-energy chapters. And we have one that's pursuing LEED certification. And I think we have a zero net energy one also. And we have some project teams looking at the Denver Green Code as written. So we kind of have projects pursuing all of them. So we don't yet have a sense that one is easier than the others, or one is not doable in Denver. So we welcome thoughts on what you think of these as options and where this is headed. And I would just add the context that the goal of the Denver Green Code, and we've talked about this before, is twofold. One is to raise the bar on some exemplary projects so that those project teams can produce these projects that show us as a community this is doable today, and so we can turn our mind to it. The other is to get engagement into the Denver Green Code provisions from as many project teams as possible, which maybe separates away from having a whole slew of different options from outside certifications, because the Denver Green Code, as we're shaping it, reflects the priorities of our community, and we want teams getting into that. And we'll talk about that more later, but I just wanted to float that out there as a consideration as well.
I have a quick question on the third one, the net zero, especially on site. And to me, as much as I'd like to put a vote there, I'm concerned about it because it depends so much on the building type, the building density, and the characteristics inherent in the site itself and its solar access. So to me, making it only on site can be a pretty harsh and at times almost impossible to achieve, depending where you are and what you're building. So I'm curious why we have so many votes on that. What you think of some projects that may be inherently problematic to achieve that on.
Can I jump in on that for a second? Because I think there's almost in every code exceptions to the rule. So if you can't do it and it's literally impossible to do it, then there should be an out to not being able to do it. But I think you should also define net zero. Is it net zero carbon? Is it net zero energy? Is it just define that a little more in this document so that conversations moving forward have the right context.
It's net zero energy.
Okay.
And these, these were in the existing Denver Green Code. So these have been around since 2019. So we're not trying to change those at all. I think we just want some feedback on, are these feasible or not? And this is not the only compliance path. So I guess we probably should have prefaced that, is that, we're hoping to have the performance compliance option, right, which is some type of third party or some type of performance-based option. But there's also the Denver Green Code as written, right, which is a bunch of performance or prescriptive requirements, right? And so we're hoping to give you guys options in those as well. So we're trying to, as you guys said, we want a lot of flexibility. We're trying to give you that. So these are not the only things that are available.
This is Daniel. Can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I can hear you.
So what would help make things more clear, and I think this might be important to do early on, is to clarify and change the language from performance compliance to something else, because there is performance compliance within the body of the Denver Green Code. There's lots of things that you comply with performance. Let's say you go to the energy chapter and you want to use performance modeling to comply. You certainly can. These other options are so that you don't have to use the majority of the body of the code. Instead, you can only address net zero energy on site and be done, and not have to address the land use or the water consumption or any of the other chapters, not even the energy chapter. You just kind of close the book. But to say that we're looking at performance compliance versus prescriptive, the way the IECC and typical energy codes use that is not accurate.
Do you have any recommendations?
I think referring to third party or energy, stellar energy performance in place of, because that's what we're saying, is that if you have a really stellar energy performance, then you don't have to do the other, the body of the code. We need a way to name that, but I think that's really what this represents. Is this net zero energy is not the only performance compliance option. There is performance compliance just like you have in the IECC, where you do modeling and you don't get to net zero energy, and that's fine. But if you do get to net zero energy, then you don't have to comply with anything else.
Okay.
That's a
Thank
good
you.
point. And I don't know, Christy, you can speak to this a little bit more. It's on passive house. It is passive house plus some areas of the code. So I think we put these in to represent as written currently.
Yeah, and I thought the as written, so we should have that on the list. As written is the fourth current compliance option, which then passive house, it would be passive house plus all of the non-energy chapters. That's one of the pathways currently.
I just got a little typo we had in there.
And then on the zero net energy one, I just wanted to clarify the way that that's defined in the Denver Green Code is zero net energy with fully on-site renewables in an all-electric building. So we do recognize that the on-site renewable energy sourcing is not feasible for every project. And I would welcome any thoughts from Katrina, because I know you're on the call. The CASTR team has been pursuing how we might be able to have expanded offsite solar opportunities available for projects around Denver. And so this option could evolve over time, but there's also the consideration that offsite solar is not equal to onsite solar. It's not an equal comparison to just put it wherever. There's loss of efficiency. There are other considerations that go into how the grid is supported. So we want to be careful about what we incentivize either way. And I'm not saying what the right answer is here, but that we came to the onsite conclusion in 2019 because that is something that project owners can control today in Denver and can address today in Denver. And if that opportunity doesn't exist for the site, there's still the passive house plus non-energy chapter option, which allows energy to take a front row seat, but you don't necessarily have to generate all of your renewable energy on site if you can't.
There's a couple comments about Living Building Challenge core certification. Does anyone want to speak to that? I haven't done.
I put that out there. The core certification is an easy. I don't want to use the word easy, but it's an easier way to get a Living Building Challenge certification. It's more comprehensive than the pedal certification. So they pulled out some of the credits from the full certification and put them into a more accessible certification. I sent Christy a lot of information about the core certification a while ago, comparing it to LEED and other certifications. So it is less challenging than the full certification, but somewhere in between pedal and the full certification. If that makes sense.
Banana that I did not eat. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Jeff Terrell from Denver Water. I think the last time I looked at the Living Building Challenge, it was fairly difficult from a from a water perspective. And maybe others know kind of how that works, but mostly on the state law issues of reuse and on-site reuse.
Yeah, and Jeff, the reason why we didn't suggest full Living Building Challenge certification is exactly for that reason. We don't think that the water pedal is necessarily achievable in Denver under current laws.
It's not, but Jeff, there are ways to work with the certification process around water in terms of if you can't do it, if you really can't do it, then you could work with ILFI to address that issue.
Okay, great.
And then I think with that, I do want to keep moving because we're on 2 and we have 9. We've got 9 of these segments to go. So going down and looking at what we've called proposal 3, having level 2 performance options. We've put these in here. And I think, for instance, on this adaptive reuse, where we have adaptive reuse plus 12% energy improvement, I think that 12%, we put that in there as a discussion starter. So I think we would like your feedback there and to talk about this a little bit more, similarly with the embodied carbon tracking, and would like to hear your feedback on these.
And just to note, we were trying to give 2 levels of aggressiveness, I guess, for what we were calling the performance option. So this would be like a level 2 option, which would have a reduced incentive, whatever the incentive level is, right? It would have a reduced incentive level. So the 4 things that we were just talking about would receive, that would be level 1, which would be 100% of incentives. And this would be a lower performance level that would be an introductory for some projects that couldn't get to LEED Platinum or zero net energy on site or living building challenge.
Quick question: with the proposals that look at 12% energy improvement or whatnot, is that compared to the IECC, and has someone looked at where the DGC is now in terms of energy improvement over the IECC?
That's a really good question, and it will depend on where the chapter lands. So right now we have the 2019 version, which I think advanced as, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was a little bit more than 10% more stringent than base code compliance when we adopted 2019. But it really depends on where we land with the energy requirements that get added to the 2021 IECC and that get discussed for the 2021 Denver Green Code. The goal is for the Denver Green Code to stay 10 to 12% ahead of the IECC at minimum, so that in the next code cycle, those things that we were kind of feeling like were the most achievable can move into the IECC and make room for new. But we won't know until we're through the committee process how it measures up.
So here's where your embodied carbon kind of comes into play. And so I know this has been a topic that, we have discussed quite a bit. And I don't know how people are tracking embodied carbon right now, if it's through an LCA, if they're using EC3, if it's been a strategic thing from the very beginning. So this would be, a great, I think, conversation starter for some of these projects to get in and actually start tracking these things. Joshua, do you still have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to, thanks. I just wanted to comment on the section. I mean, I think this is the right direction, very much so. I feel like the first category is a poor proxy for what we want. And I would sort of say that for probably all of those things that are mentioned up there. I think we're starting to really hone in on the things that are, I think, important, at least from a carbon perspective. There's some non-carbon things that I would put in here as well, and maybe that comes later, things like green infrastructure, maybe that's below. But I think for here, I would have a prerequisite for all electric. I think that's the most important thing to sort of be pushing as the sort of next phase, if that's not already in the code. I think I agree with the comment on the 12%. I think 12% feels like the right level, but it obviously depends on the baseline. And I think I would allow people to choose, or projects to choose multiple of these, say 3 of these to equal tier 1. Like in my mind, if you're doing all electric, you're doing some amount of energy efficiency, you're doing embodied carbon tracking, and I would add, let's say you're doing 50% of your roof is solar, or some like or 75% of your roof is solar, then you're doing as much, a significant amount towards the zero carbon goals. And that feels like it should be weighted as heavily as, a net zero project as a tier 1. And again, I would just sort of add, I think there should be an option to do green infrastructure related things. It may also be like, adaptive use could count as one of these. I think it shouldn't be sufficient in and of its own, but it should be part of a menu that can get you there more easily. So I like this section.
Thank you.
And do you guys feel, it sounds like, Josh, this is also sort of what you were saying in terms of keeping that goal in mind of these things ideally will be moving into the mandatory code, and this voluntary code, part of the idea is a little bit of a pilot, right? We want to test out these things and incubate them to find out their feasibility, and then ideally we'll move them into mandatory. So giving these sort of as an alternative option to just following the entire DGC prescriptively, does that feel equivalent to you?
I think I lost the thread. Sorry, Kara, say again.
Okay. Just trying to meet that broader goal of getting these things into a mandatory code for all buildings. Do you feel that having, say, a combination of 3 of these will achieve those goals the way that the prescriptive code as written? Do you think that these are good things to incubate now that we could make mandatory later, I guess is my question.
Yes, and these are exactly the things that I think you should incubate now if they're not mandatory already. I think we could add to that list of specific things, but I think these are the right direction, especially for carbon focus. I also feel like these don't require you to be an expert in certifications to sort of untangle. Like this makes it, I think, much more accessible for most project teams. It's not necessarily easy to do all electric in every situation, but it is going to be hopefully the next code cycle. And so it's exactly, Kara, I think the things to incubate.
Great, thank you.
So a couple quick things, a comment and a question, just in related to the carbon tracking. Would love it if there was some incentives that revolve around mass timber, compared to concrete or steel, which obviously just have a huge environmental effect. Whereas kind of the mass timber is just, we're actively trying to crack the code on trying to get mass timber integrated into our projects and actually make it cost effective. I have heard whispers that the 2021 IBC is going to reduce the requirements on covering up the amount of timber. Like right now, if you're kind of above, I think it's like 7 or 8 stories, you get into a 4B2 category and you have to cover up 80% of the mass timber, which obviously has a great aesthetic appearance to it, but we're kind of going in the other direction when we talk about the environmental impact and creating gypsum, which is a very similar process as creating cement. So it would love to be, if there was any opportunity to have that discussion. This is much more of like a planning or a building department conversation, probably. But if there is ever any conversations, would love to be a part of that, especially when the city looks at adopting the 2021 IBC. And then just a question regarding, I think, the 12% energy improvement and the all electric. This also kind of, I think, coattails onto like the district scale. So Populous, the hotel that I'm working on 14th and Court, just next to the web building, we actively looked at strategies to, become more environmental stewards from energy standpoint. We did kick the tires on LEED Platinum. There's a lot of, with LEED version 4, it just was an uphill battle. There's just a lot of complexities with that just added a lot of costs. We pursued district cooling. There's two things that really threw us off there. That not sure if the city is having any conversations with Excel. Their terms and conditions are very difficult for developers to get comfortable with. There's pretty much no, and this is, you know, more so an impact from a steam standpoint, but it has future risk from a district cooling standpoint, that their rates are pretty much, they can increase their rates at a whim. And it really creates a lot of risk for developers. Not sure if that's ever kind of something that's been taken into consideration. But that was really the driver for us steering away from a district option. And I'm not sure if this is true, but I've heard rumors that the district cooling side of things from Excel, I mean, there's all of these huge facilities around downtown, that they don't capture any of their condensate and turn that into recovery, which is something that from an individual building system standpoint is an active part in trying to do heat recovery. Would just be curious holistically if, you know, we're having these conversations with individual developers to do things on a small scale to help the big picture. Is the city having the same conversation with Excel on a global scale, which has exponentially more impact on kind of the, you know, the regional environment. And then in terms of just like this all electric, one of the things that we did kind of kick the tires on, it didn't really come to fruition, but one of the strategies that we looked into pretty hard in order to increase our kind of environmental stewardship and kind of be more efficient on a project level was what's called a CHP, combined heating and power solution, that involved natural gas, a natural gas generator, and just all of the stuff that we kind of heard on this is it reduces the overall and the environmental impact on the project itself, and just creates those efficiencies. Again, heat recovery within the loop, reducing the environmental impact. And I know that there's a overall drive for the city to steer away from natural gas. Now, obviously, when you look at, well, just, okay, if everything is going solar or what, sustainable energy sources, ultimately that's a benefit. But would love to just know if there's kind of holistic conversations about kind of natural gas and, you know, solution, HVAC mechanical engineering solutions that are actually fairly efficient with natural gas. And I think Fred brought this up in a previous thing, you know, natural gas boilers, you know, if you're going to switch that to all electric, you're just going to be jacking up your overall electrical consumption on projects, which is counterintuitive to me.
One thing I'll add to that conversation about mass timber is responsibly sourced mass timber. So if we're going to provide incentives towards mass timber from an embodied carbon perspective, let's make sure it's responsibly sourced, because if this trend continues and everyone starts moving over to mass timber, we're not doing ourselves any favors on a global scale if these aren't responsibly sourced. And then also from an embodied carbon standpoint, like Eric was mentioning, the concrete, steel, and the gypsum are some key components to that usually turn into the focus areas of try to reduce when you're going through an LCA process on projects. And I've seen other municipalities starting to focus on that as well, to set limits on specific concrete mixes, set limits on you know, recycled steel content, and setting those thresholds. So instead of maybe this overall percent, you know, 10% improvement from, you know, some sort of baseline, the other way you could look at it is looking at those specific materials that we know are large contributors to embodied carbon.
Good point.
All right, should we keep moving down here and talk about some tiered options for prescriptive compliance.
I can take
where you want to take that? Thanks, Kristen.
So we have, I think, 3 options, and we're trying to figure out how we use tiers or levels to create some flexibility in the DGC as written. And so right now we have 1 level of prescriptive compliance to earn the incentives, and that's listed out in the table that's at the very beginning of the DGC. So we have kind of 2 proposals, and it's just a different way of looking at them. So I think the first proposal 4 is really for half of the incentives, meeting all of the required measures. So we'd identify which measures in the DGC would be required, and those would be for the level 1. Those would hopefully be the low cost options to make this really approachable. And then level 2 would be, obviously the higher level, meeting all of the required measures plus some number of electives. And I think we just put in 15 there because that's how many there were in the existing table. So having a set number of required measures plus some level of electives for the higher threshold. The other option is to have it be a complete cafeteria menu where you select all of the electives and the number is just what changes from, say, 10 to 20 in the 2 levels. So I think this is kind of an either or. Do you want it to be 1 level or 2 levels? And then do you want them to have mandatory measures and then electives, or all electives? Hopefully that was clear. So you guys can take your stars and vote. Are you guys having any issues with stars on the mural board? You guys can speak up and tell us why you like one versus the other, and we can drag stars for you.
I've placed a star here. I think I understand that we may want to look at prescriptive to really make sure that the things that were really are important to the city are taken care of. But I think, being a consultant for as long as I have, you always run into projects that are just unique circumstances that may not be able to hit the prescriptive requirements. And so just knowing that there's always going to be those really unique projects out there, the broad cafeteria menu that you mentioned for just selecting electives, I think makes things a bit more digestible for developers, in my opinion. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I think someone said it before too, that the devil's in the details, right? Because if you go that route, then you want to make sure that there's not a path that everyone does because it's the easiest thing to do.
Right. And I think we're looking at all of the electives being what's in the current DGC now. So I know that we want to avoid kind of getting in the details here because we want to get this high level feedback from you guys. But if you've read the DGC in detail, right, all of these measures that are in there would be some of the electives, right? So I don't have it up, but I was going to say maybe we can come up with some examples.
One thought for me on why the electives might make sense is that we might, if we're able to invest the effort in after the fact, we might learn from what people are doing and what those costs are and are not. I mean, as the previous speaker said, every project is unique. This might help us to figure out what's feasible and what's not. We might find that some of those pieces nobody ever does, and in interviews after the fact, you might find, well, we all looked at it and it added X amount to the cost of the project and it just wasn't viable. So we might learn for future cycles by doing the electives.
Yeah, that's good feedback. I think there was a comment in the chat about having minimum required within each chapter, so you couldn't trade like a low VOC for a light pollution. So trying to make things equivalent. I think you do kind of get into that situation, right, where they're not all necessarily equal. And that would be, you know, something that we'd have to overcome. So I don't know if we've missed some people. I only see a few stars on this one. I just want to make sure that we don't move on without getting everyone's opinion here.
Kristen, I think the reason I haven't answered is because I feel like we're looking sort of forward for sort of new types of electives. So it feels hard. So I guess maybe the option is like we don't move forward with any new ones, but we just essentially make the existing ones more of a sort of a la carte menu option.
Yes.
To do that. So okay, so one of these would be, should we be able to vote for don't do that and just move forward with new things?
So not having prescriptive at all?
No, I mean, I actually like the idea of prescriptive, but I like the prescriptive with sort of an updated list of measures.
Okay. I would just write a comment on that.
Okay, sorry.
I mean, I think out of what we see in the DGC as it stands today, right, in the 2019 version, you know, do we present to the committee, you know, a list of what we want to be required in the Denver Green Code, and then have you guys elect some other options that are in there currently, right? Or is it all just pick and choose? So we're really working from what's existing in there as an elective. But I hear you that you would like to see some new electives also in there.
Well, but just for clarity, that is part of the 2021 Denver Green Code committee process, is to add provisions into this code. So unless I'm just misunderstanding the conversation here, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Yes, what's in the code would be provisions that would be considered as electives, but we're also welcoming proposals for how we should update those. If there are thoughts on some of those not being what they should be, we want those proposals to come in from the community, and we're going to be bringing new content proposals to the committee to consider, so that at the end of 2021, or at the end when we adopt the 2021 code, it is updated and all of those things will be fitted into the system. We're just talking about how the code will work. What electives currently, some of that's unknown. We're looking for help shaping those, though.
Okay, I added my star. Thanks, Kristen.
I mean, does it matter? Just having 2 levels of incentive, is that enough? Does it matter how it's structured?
Kristen, to address your question from my perspective, I think I'm just a little confused on, does it matter how the the electives and the incentives are structured, knowing what the project specific concerns are. Let's just say hypothetically that I'm very constrained with FAR. Height's not a problem, FAR is a problem. Is these incentives, does that include, just thinking out loud and just trying to think of an example here, when we say 50% of incentives or 100% of incentives, are we kind of saying that, hey, we'll give you more FAR if you are able to achieve 10 of the electives that are kind of presented later on? Is that what I'm just kind of getting at here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that we don't really know what the electives are going to be yet. And so what we really just want to establish is 2 levels of performance, either a level 1 that's should be more attainable to all projects that have constraints, and then kind of a higher level where there'll be the full whatever the incentives are, the full level of incentives. So just knocking down the incentives to say 50% of them, whatever they end up being, if they're monetary or not monetary, for someone to get into the Denver Green Code that maybe thought it wasn't achievable before. So that's really the intent.
And is this kind of would be considered like on a project by project basis, not necessarily like, hey, tick the box here, and like I heard menu kind of brought up earlier. I mean, it's definitely not that simple, you know, trying to just work out like, okay, we want to do the right thing. We want to, you know, take into consideration these electives and start pushing the envelope. But yeah, you know, we're constrained by FAR. So we add more FAR to the project that gives us more net rentable square footage that makes our revenue, you know, projections higher, that can potentially offset the additional costs and burden on the project. Or can we reduce parking in order to help? Is that what I'm kind of, is that the, am I interpreting this correctly, that that's the incentives that we're talking about?
Yes, whatever, yes. It could be not monetary, it could be non-monetary. We don't, you know, I think we're discussing those right now, and I'm not sure, you know, how much we can offer. I guess the idea was, yes, there will be a lower level and a higher level based on performance or prescriptive, you know, whatever you go after. There should be the correlation between the incentives and the level of effort for the design team should match.
I would definitely suggest then that that's, I mean, 50%, 100%, like just drawing lines in the sand, I think is going to really constrain projects. If there was more of like an incremental approach to say, well, you know, one elective 10, this is broad brush statements. And I think that there would really need to be a lot of finite analysis on the cost of the electives in order to really, I mean, nobody's trying to benefit from trying to be sustainable. It's just how do we offset them? So if we have one elective, it's going to, you know, have X impact. How can we incrementally then try to offset that? You know, is it 1 versus 10% incentives, 2 versus 20% incentives, is it 5 for, you know, 13% of incentives?
Two levels, like a lower level and a higher level.
And maybe I'll just interject here, Eric. We like that idea, and in an ideal perfect world, we would really like to be able to administer a code that leaves the Chinese food menu open, right? Like it becomes really difficult to administer in a fair and consistent way when we start ratcheting to that degree, when we layer in the added conversation that incentives are a whole separate conversation with the community, and trying to figure out how things get incentivized it's definitely something that is being discussed, but there is a tremendous degree of complexity to that. So I think we want to hold on to what you're saying, because it would be the ideal way for us to be able to address this, to say the more you do, the more you get. The the challenge is in actually turning that into something that's applicable. We won't be able to do that for 2021. So we're suggesting the 2 tiers because we wanted to introduce something that can be developed reasonably and fairly within this year, with a long-term discussion related to refining that further, definitely still on the table. So not trying to dismiss that at all. It's just what is logistically possible with the community process, with the efforts that we can accomplish for the 2021 code. That's the challenge that we've got to navigate right now.
Understood. Thank you.
Kira, do you want to lead us into the last section?
Yeah. So we're offering these up as some new prescriptive compliance path requirements. And again, I think these are kind of conversation starters in my mind. I think some of these are things we would start maybe smaller now and broaden in future code cycles. And potentially for some project types, I think that they should be mandatory, but I think we want your input on that. So I think we've talked about this a little bit in proposal 6. We could do an ecological impact plan. That's one that I don't know that what I've heard from Christy is maybe getting this completely fleshed out for 2021 is too big of a reach. But where can we start now to start building these ecological impact plans? I think that goes straight to the site and the water concerns that were identified as high priority. Education and engagement, number 7, that was also a really high priority that we heard from everyone and that we agree with. And I think either developing a program for the city to help with this high performance building project trainings, or I think if a project wanted to pursue providing that training through other means for their project teams could be an option. And then the neighborhood assessment and implementation in number 8, I think this one is one especially where, you know, if you have a project that is more than one individual site or is a certain area of square footage, that those community level neighborhood assessment plan would be, and using that process would be one. And then we heard from you all last time about having kind of some innovation type credits. So based on your feedback and some things that we came up with, we put out a list of potentially what some projects could pursue for some kind of pre-approved innovation paths. And Kristen, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how these would fit into the current prescriptive code structure.
Sure. I think, you know, these are the things that we really heard from you guys that were important. And so because they would be more important and more valuable, and we want to, you know, have more project teams pursue these, you know, we were thinking about weighting them a little bit heavier than, say, 1 elective. So maybe these are worth 5 because they're harder and they do have, you know, a more collaborative approach to some of these. So that's really kind of, you know, and this list could be expanded to include other things. Also, there could be an option for a write your own innovation strategy, right? So maybe if we haven't covered it here, it could be something else. But just an idea that you know, we've put a lot of framework here, but if there is an option for pursuing something that's kind of outside of the box, then we can put it in this innovation category.
If I could, just 2 quick thoughts on here. One is, you know, a lot of what you've listed here is potentially ties really nicely into, for example, nonprofit projects where we're really seeing a social sustainability impact. And I think that's interesting, and would love to see that kind of incorporated in that pathway for nonprofits in particular. On the innovation stuff, one thing to perhaps consider is that you might be able to bring in some nonprofit partners who do this sort of work, so that there's somewhat of a clearer path, rather than everybody reinventing the wheel on urban agriculture. Well, here's an approved partner in Denver Urban Gardens. As we look at housing and job creation, or not necessarily that, but as we look at some of the community level stuff, maybe community wealth building, which is kind of a neat little nonprofit, is a resource that can be part of the list and pre-approved list to say, you know, boy, if you want to go down this rather than reinventing it, here's our list of nonprofit partners who work in these areas, and you've got a little bit of an easier path because you're not drawing it up yourself, you're not making it up from scratch. Reach out to them. And then we're also, I think, helping to support those nonprofits, which has additional benefits.
That's fantastic.
And maybe if I could just take a minute to clarify on the ecological impact plan. The thought on that is simply that could have a tremendously impactful, all-encompassing approach to it. And so we are floating it out there as a potential option for the future as far as compliance goes. But the challenge that the city has to navigate is making the different pathways in some way measurable, so that it's not just a subjective judgment whether or not a project complies. So we would have to create a framework by which to judge projects that wanted to come in and discuss the ecological impact on the city. And we don't have that framework currently. And to try to do that in 2021 is probably not something that's feasible. So we put this as a potential path with the thought being that this could be a path for the future. So we welcome thoughts that might support that or raise concerns about that or whatever everybody thinks. And then in the meantime, we would like to try to figure out if there is a piece of that makes sense for 2021, but it's not a full compliance path because the subjective nature of it currently, without having a framework in place, makes it not very viable as a path per se. Because we just can't sit in the city offices and be subjective about our evaluation of how projects comply with code. So we need a little time to catch up with that. And just for further clarification, when we say ecological impact, again, it's the definition of ecological is not just environmental, it's environmental, social, and economic. It's understanding the full needs of the city and how one project site sits within that context and contributes positively to those full needs.
This is Daniel. I think that there was mention about giving a large weight of credit for these innovation categories. What if there was a smaller credit in the 2021, but it was just for putting together a proposal, whether it was evaluated or not? Because I think the effort involved in that, especially if someone does partner with an approved, partner as described, which is a fantastic idea. I think that effort alone could deserve some credit.
Yeah, almost recognizing that success is, when it comes to innovation, success is not necessarily the only measure of success, and that the actual just coming up with the innovation deserves some credit because it will feed future innovation.
Yeah, it definitely sets the path for the future.
So one idea that would love to just put on the table, and I'm trying to connect to the mural and my computer's being difficult. I was just in New York earlier in the week and toured a bunch of projects that had a lot of focus on biophilia and creating more greenery, not only from an ecological standpoint, but for like the health and well-being of residents. And one of the things that they mentioned that helps incentivize developers to plant trees on balconies as well as interior spaces is that it's potentially not counted against the FAR. Not sure if that's something that City of Denver would be open to considering, but it's not necessarily a code thing. It's more of a planning element. So if there's potentially a carve out that did allow developers to really spend money and time and resources and net rentable square footage to establishing green spaces, whether it's on an exterior balcony or kind of an interior in a conditioned space. I think like the Amazon spheres up in Seattle is a great example of this as well, trying to create these green spaces. But it hurts when you look at trying to get to the bottom line and increase your net rentable square footage and increase your revenue. So if there was an opportunity to kind of taking 100 square feet on a shared amenity space and doing this intensive planting, that was just not counted towards the FAR, that would help. Sounds like everybody really likes my proposal.
No, I wasn't commenting. I was filing it away in my brain as how we would consider doing something like that. And it feels like that could be a provision proposal that would go in. Like I was just trying to file it into where it would fit with the Denver Green Code. And rather than being an incentive, even though you're describing it as an incentivization, I feel like it's an elective measure that would build towards Denver Green Code compliance that could then move into changing the zoning. It would be a conversation about how that works from a definition standpoint and how we could make that work logistically.
Does anyone on this call know how Denver zoning, what incentives would be equal to like an FAR incentive? Because they don't use FAR. Would it be a story height?
They do in one area. They do in Golden Triangle.
Yeah, so it is. We've had different conversations about density, height, FAR. We would have to figure out how to translate that so that it would make sense and how that could be counted. I don't have the answer, but I think that the zoning varies enough that there might be a couple of different answers that would make that viable.
Yeah, and it's not only in Golden Triangle. My project in downtown is constrained by FAR. And I'm not an expert at this, so bear with me if I'm speaking off the mark, but I think it's more of a planning thing. The Denver specific planning code has carve outs for things like ground floor activation. So all of our restaurant space on our ground level is not counted against our FAR. Still GFA, but it's not counted against FAR. So I think the opportunity would be something that would be a Denver specific amendment, this next code adoption. Maybe it's outside the green building ordinance. Maybe it's not. Maybe, I don't know. But just in terms of that bullet point for number 6, I think this would certainly be something that would help planning in our projects move forward. Ironically, in Golden Triangle. But yeah, we're trying to push the envelope on this kind of stuff. I mean, you look at some of the developments in Australia, there's greenery everywhere, and they're highly acclaimed as some of the most sustainable projects and the most socially responsible projects from kind of a quality of life standpoint, these apartment complexes and offices. So it's just a burden right now if we try to integrate that into our project. So food for thought.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And we'll have to talk to some of the other work groups because I don't know exactly where it lives, but I understand the idea and I think it's worth a discussion and to try to figure that out.
There's one project right now in Rhino that Davis is working on in conjunction with a outside architect group called MAD or IMAD that has this just beautiful green swath taken out at the north side of the building. And I'd be curious to know how they kind of view that. But that would certainly help them as well to kind of promote this concept that other architects and other developers are already looking at.
And it really highlights how important it is that this go beyond, that this be a concerted effort. I mean, planning services needs to be part of it. As we look at performance stuff, well, reduction in vehicle miles traveled seems to me to be part of the equation, even though that's a building thing. So that starts to get into Dottie's TDM efforts and how can we incorporate that work that people are already now doing because of Dottie? How can we incorporate that into this when we start to measure success?
So Christy, maybe the other thing too is looking at how it benefits the neighborhood. So in terms of, the green projects that were brought up in Australia, there's some in Japan as well. The internal green things are great for the residents and the people that use that parcel. But the green on the exterior is what benefits the public, right? So I think you have a different layer or a different level of incentive versus what that greenery is. If you have a garden on the inside of the parcel or in the interior of the building, that's great for those people. If you do a green exterior green wall that's providing green, but also doing some water harvesting and things like that, that benefits everybody. It's not just a internal thing.
Jim, I fully agree with that statement. And if the stars align, if there was some sort of incentive structure, we would be pushing hard to try to do both interior and exterior landscaping throughout the building. There's a lot of constraints to doing that, especially in a high desert climate with the sunlight, the intense sunlight that we have.
Yeah, and I actually think if we could incentivize where you have both and it's continuous, I think now you're really talking some innovation, because now you're talking about including structure to provide some of that green space, whether it's, the way the building shades the plants in the afternoon, or whether it's a roof structure or some other kind of thing where it's, the indoor outdoor feel. There's just tons of, my mind's just racing right now with all kinds of ideas and thoughts, so maybe it's a 3-tiered system.
Jim, I'm going to post a project in Sydney that will help keep your mind turning even more.
Awesome. Thank you.
Is there anything else on this? I think we did want to touch on one more thing. I know we only have about 15 minutes left. The column on the right, I know we've been using that kind of for notes, but Kira, do you want to kind of talk us through that and see if we can get some feedback?
Yeah.
Obviously we've presented a lot of stuff. We've thrown a lot of stuff at you today. And we want to make sure that it's doable for you. So.
Yeah. So our thoughts here were to get some feedback, and this is a great time to circle back around to it after we have talked through all of all of these proposals and all of these great innovation ideas. Just asking, you know, what supports would you need to, if we were to say, of the Denver Green Code has to be done on every project. Do you all feel like that is feasible? Would you, and I think that so far our thought has been, you know, could we make that a cherry pick? Pick one, two things out of the Denver Green Code to do on your project. And I think one of the big goals here is to encourage readership of the prescriptive code and to help people really get into the mindset of this stuff is coming down the pike and we want to make it mandatory. So please start thinking about it. Please start including it in your projects. Do you all feel like that is feasible? Do you have an idea of how many things you think would be feasible to ask of people?
I could kind of just quickly just state my 2 cents. I mean, for Urban Village's standpoint, a lot of the stuff that we're describing is kind of just in our DNA. We're trying to push the envelope. I think the things that excite me is the adaptive reuse support, is the carbon sequestration support, is the ecological support that could help incentivize things. But I really caution how this group moves forward in terms of mandating these requirements onto the broader development community. I think this just kind of goes back into the education standpoint, and my mural is not working right now. So if somebody can just drag a star in all of the 6 through 10 into the support category for me, I definitely think that they're all very great ideas. But I'm curious to see how the broader development community is going to react if these are kind of if they're forced upon. And I just really encourage just a conversation about how to financially support developers, more so the little guys, the little groups, to not burden them to the point where their projects are becoming unfeasible. And I think what was brought up about there's other organizations that can help aid in this stuff, I think is something from an education standpoint that really needs to be put on the table. But in terms of just there's 3 groups that we need to break education towards. It's the development community, it's the broader neighbors, neighborhoods, and it's the people that are actually living in them. I'm happy to go on a tangent to anybody who wants to kind of hear about, my experience with leasing apartments and talking about LEED and kind of how residents see this. And at the end of the day, we're talking about kind of consumers, that it's their money. And there's a lot of people that, will share these environmental goals as everybody here, but when it comes down to the bottom line, they're not willing to pay for it. So it's a balancing act between all of these different parties.
So just to speak to that a little bit, I think just to underscore what Kira was saying, the thought on making something mandatory, we're not suggesting that this whole code or that some level of tiered compliance of this code would be mandatory. We're literally saying if we said pick 5, any 5, I don't care which 5, or 1 or 3 from the whole entire Denver Green Code, we know that there are things in there that don't cost any money. So it's not adding to the development cost of projects. The intention of doing that would not be to raise the bar on the performance of those projects. Picking 3 things from this code isn't going to substantially impact the performance of building projects across Denver. The intention is to get our development community engaging with the Denver Green Code. And so that's the goal. But but the concern is that if we say you have to pick 3 things, and concern is maybe the wrong word. The question is, we know that there are some firms who would say, oh, great, I have to pick 3, fine. There's somebody over there who has half a day to skim through this Denver Green Code, understand what the choices are, and they're going to make recommendations on projects. Not a big deal. But then there are other firms or there are homeowners who might need some support in order to navigate the Denver Green Code and pick the 3 things that don't cost any money on their project. But it forces them to get into there to say, oh, these are all priorities that the community brought forward, and these things might become mandatory. And maybe I should be thinking about this stuff, because when these things become mandatory, it's going to take some effort. Because there's a lot of stuff in here that doesn't add cost to projects. There are some things that do, no doubt. But there are a lot of things that don't, especially if they're considered upfront during the early phases of design, which is how we need to be changing the mindset so that this stuff is being considered early. So our real question is, if we were to pick some really, really minimal level just to get people engaged with the Denver Green Code, is further support needed for teams to not recoil in horror or experience duress? Because for whatever reason, that minimal level of just reading this code and finding those things that don't cost money is too hard. And maybe that additional support isn't needed. I don't know, but that's why we're asking the question.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you're saying, Christy, and I'm sold. You don't got to sell me. It's figuring out how to sell and market this to the rest of the community, including residents. And if what we're talking about is the 3 things that have 0 cost impact, easy. This is not going to affect your projects. That's low hanging fruit. I think what I heard in the first session is that here's the big picture. We want to become net zero by 2030, and just cherry picking those 3 things off of this code is not necessarily going to get you there. It's just these little baby steps that we got a marathon to run. So I'm thinking bigger than this, and looking at, yes, there's a residential component of this. Yes, there's a small scale commercial development component of this. But there's a large scale commercial development component to this, and trying to incentivize those big multi-hundred unit, hundreds of thousands of square foot of office space developers between now during this code cycle. That's the opportunity that I would love to help support and encourage, just this incentive program to help ratchet those developers up, because there is going to be a lot of development between now and the next code cycle. So how do we incentivize those? Because we'll miss an opportunity that we can never gain back otherwise.
And it's the both and, because we can put the best incentives out there, and there is still going to be a whole bunch of people who are just going to develop to the baseline because they can make a profit doing that and not take the incentives. So I think from our perspective, we want to be pursuing both, because the incentives are their own challenge to navigate. And we do that in conjunction with the community, because we can't just assign value ourselves. We have to work with the community. As soon as we start incentivizing something, we're speaking on the behalf of the community about what will be allowed that's different from what's allowed today. And that gets into really tricky territory. So we definitely want to continue to work on that, but we can't make the determination on the incentives easily. That is a process in and of itself that is very much alive and part of the dialogue, and we're fully on board with. But the other part is for all of those developers, because there are a ton of projects that are being developed by developers or homes that are being built by homeowners who wouldn't really be that interested in the incentives, who wouldn't necessarily pursue an incentivized project, but they are also shaping this community really impactfully. And we've got to find a way to get our mandatory codes advancing. And it's that group that's going to suffer if we advance the mandatory codes too quickly without them having engaged in some way. So this part of the question is not to undermine at all the value in figuring out a better way to incentivize and engage more full participation in the Denver Green Code. it's just to try to understand how we can capture and bring everybody else along as well in a way that doesn't put people out of business or cause duress, because we want to be able to move our mandatory codes as quickly as we can. That if we don't move our mandatory codes, there will be a lot of projects that don't get captured that will continue to impact Denver in a way that isn't conscious and isn't directed in a mindful way. So we're trying to understand, like, to us, we were thinking, and we welcome other ideas. We were thinking that the first thing that we've got to overcome here is the fact that nobody, I shouldn't say nobody, that's wrong. A very small percentage of the community read the 2019 Denver Green Code with focus, which means that when we go to move things into mandatory codes, we have to be super careful because there wasn't a great deal of absorption about what was to come. So we'd like to do better in 2021 with that readership so that in 2024, when we move things to mandatory codes, the shock doesn't occur because everybody has been engaging with the subject matter and understanding that, yes, the community has brought this priority forward and it will matter to build projects in Denver. So I don't know if there is support needed or if there isn't. We can adopt the Denver Green Code and say everybody has to pick 3 things, and maybe the community can just succeed if we say that, and then that gets everybody reading it and the conversation is done. But I got a sense from the other conversations that it might not be as simple as that. There might be some members of the community who will struggle with having to navigate this code and find those 3 things. But I welcome thoughts because that we're taking our best guess here on what the reaction will be.
Yeah, just to focus, I take three things are easy, especially the low hanging fruit. But I think it's the bigger picture that let me know if we have a lot of data, a lot of costs. I'm sure a lot of people on this call and committee do too. If there's anything that I could do to support the neighborhood outreach, please let me know.
Thank you.
Do we have any other comments or questions before we wrap up for today? Okay, I'm not hearing anybody jump in at the moment. I do want to just let everyone know the next steps in the process. Before I do that though, I want to extend a sincere thank you to everyone who participated, not only in today's meeting, but also in the previous 1 or 2. And for anyone who is actually in all of the energy working group conversations, thank you also as well. So the next steps in this process are to take the information that we've received today, in addition to meetings 1 and 2, and to formally develop many of these into code amendment proposals that will be heard either in the Green Code or in other codes or potentially other regulations outside of kind of the building codes where they would be applicable. So those formal amendment proposals will be developed. They'll be posted on our website as they are prepared, and at a very minimum, a week prior to the actual hearing dates. So you can certainly monitor our 2021 building code process website for that.